If you have a Bible, turn to Genesis chapter 39. Genesis chapter 39. As we look at the life of Joseph, and we'll hopefully learn something here this morning. I know, in case you missed it, I am not Brother Dale. If I was, that meant I got a lot shorter and a lot younger. He's not here, so I can make jokes at his expense. But no, he is sick. When he called me and he sounded like he was talking through a tunnel, I said, "Oh no, you're asking me to preach." And he said, "I know it's your first week." And so, but I'm excited as you turn to Genesis 39, as over the last couple months, I've been preparing a Bible study for students. Even though I wasn't here, as I prayed about what direction I wanted to lead them and what we wanted to learn, I started putting together a Bible study that would chronologically walk through different people throughout the Bible, through their lives and through the things that they experienced, and so that we could learn that. And so, as I kind of looked at what God had already been working in my own life, I kept coming back to the story of Joseph. In case you don't know a lot about Joseph, he's one of the only people outside of Jesus that it never focuses on his flaws. There are no flaws in the life of Joseph. Go and read his story. He did nothing wrong. In fact, a lot of times if you go and you read, he's a type of Christ, meaning he looks a lot like Jesus in what he does. Hated for no reason, thrown into a pit, given over into something that wasn't his fault. But each and every time God blessed through it, and God blessed others, and to the point where Joseph would save not only his brothers' lives, but the lives of many, many people. And so Joseph is an important character. And so we get to this story kind of in the middle of his life where he's in the service of a man named Potiphar. Joseph has been sold into slavery. He's found himself in an Egyptian household. But yet, even in the midst of his circumstances, God chooses to use Joseph to be a blessing to others. And there's one reason for that, and that's the key point for today. He has self-control. He doesn't whine about the things that he can't control in his life. He realizes real quick, and I wish that if I had been a child, this would have been what I was taught, that you can't always control the circumstances, but you can control how you respond to them. That's the message in a nutshell. That's what Joseph understands. Hey, I can't control that I'm in this Egyptian household, but I sure as can control how I act in it. And we see how God blesses that. So if you have your Bible, turn to Genesis chapter 39. I'll begin reading there in verse 1. It says, "Now Joseph had been taken to Egypt, and an Egyptian named Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him there. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he had become a successful man, serving in the household of his Egyptian master. And when his master saw that the Lord was with him, and the Lord made everything he did successful, Joseph found favor with his master and became his personal attendant. Now Potiphar also put him in charge of his household and placed all that he owned under his authority. And from that time, he put him in charge of his household and all that he owned. The Lord blessed the Egyptian's house because of Joseph. And the Lord's blessing was on all that he owned in his house and in his fields. And he left all that he owned under Joseph's authority. He did not concern himself with anything except the food that he ate. And now Joseph was well built and handsome. And after some time, his master's wife looked longingly at Joseph and said, 'Sleep with me.' But he refused. 'Look,' he said to his master's wife, 'with me here, my master does not concern himself with anything in his house, and he has put all things he owns under my authority. That no one in this house is greater than I am, but he has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. So how could I do this immense evil, and how could I sin against God?' And although she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused. Now one day he went into the house to do his work, and none of the household servants were there. And she grabbed him by his garments and said, 'Sleep with me.' But leaving his garment in her hand, he escaped and ran outside. And when she saw that he had left his garment with her and run outside, she called to her household servants. 'Look,' she said to them, 'my husband brought a Hebrew man to make fools of us. He came to me so he could sleep with me, and I screamed as loud as I could. And when he heard me screaming for help, he left his garment beside me and ran outside.' And she put Joseph's garment beside her until his master came home. And then she told him the same story, that the Hebrew slave you brought to us came to make a fool of me, but when I screamed for help, he left his garment beside me and ran outside. When his master heard the story his wife told him, these are the things your slave did to me, he was furious and had him thrown into prison where the king's prisoners were confined. And so Joseph was there in prison. That's a dramatic story of how you go from bottom to top, back down to the bottom. That you think everything's wonderful, and now I'm back in prison. But if you were to continue reading the life of Joseph, you would know that Joseph continues to be blessed because he had learned a lot of different things that he just uses over and over in his life. So number one, that the person with self-control has the blessings of God. That oftentimes we find ourselves in the middle of difficult circumstances. Whether we bring them on ourselves or whether they're just the situations of life or Satan's against us, whatever the case, we'll often find ourselves in difficult circumstances. And it's in those situations that you really see where your heart has trust. Jesus said it a better way. He said, where a man's treasure is, there his heart is also. Wherever you run to, wherever you turn, however you respond in difficult situations, typically will show who you really trust. When Joseph was faced with this issue with Potiphar's wife, when he was faced with slavery, when he was faced with serving a master who was not his father, he knew who to turn to, and he trusted God through it, and God blessed him. Too often, though, when we find ourselves in difficult circumstances, what do? I know what I do, so I won't say what we do, so I'll just share what I do. We whine. We complain. Oh, Lord, this can't happen to me. I'm too special. I know none of you ever say that. None of you ever act like that to God. I know I do. Lord, I'm too important for this to happen with. Are you sure that you've got the right Gary Havlin on the list? Because my grandfather's Gary Havlin. I'm sure he could use some of these problems himself. And God says, no, I know exactly where you're at. See, too often we go to whining. I had a good deacon friend. You go to his house, and he had all these tractors. But the biggest sign in his house said, no whining, no whining, no whining. And I'd ask him about it. So where did you come up with that? He said, oftentimes I come across people who just want to whine. That, oh, my poor, pitiful me. And they never stop and say, God, thank you. Thank you that I'm alive. Thank you that I can breathe. Thank you that you give me opportunities to serve you despite where I'm at. And I said, man, that's pretty good. I'm going to use that again. And so I'm earning that today. I'm using that today. But Joseph is a good example of a person who made the best of an awful situation. I don't know about you, but I don't know how I would respond if my brother came to me and said, I just don't really like you, so I'm going to throw you in a pit. And then my other brother, I don't have another brother, so the story breaks down at this point, says, I don't think that this is pretty bad. We should just sell him into slavery. And I don't know if my faith in God would be very strong to say, thank you. I would be pretty down in the dumps. But as we search through Scripture over and over, we see where people trust God, even in the worst of circumstances. And I don't even have to go through all the stories that you can think of, all the people who trusted God despite what they were going through. Job, Joseph, Jesus. Father, I don't want to go to the cross. If there's any other way, let this cup pass. And God says, no, there's no other way. All right. Then that's how it is. We see these people who trust God, and through that they bring blessings to themselves, but they also bring blessings to others. Go back and look at the story. It says, from the time that Joseph was put in charge of Potiphar's house, all that Potiphar owned was blessed because of Joseph. Because Joseph chose to serve the Lord and exercise self-control, God used him to bring blessings to Potiphar's house. Unfortunately, though, we stand in a world where nothing is our fault. Everything's to blame. Everything's against us. The world hates me. I can't get anything right. And we never stop and we never ask, God, what are you trying to do through this? God, what are you trying to show me for those who are around me? Because, God, I don't know what to do. We never ask those questions. We just move forward and we push forward. Because let's take a moment and think, what if God had just said, Joseph, you're too good for this. I'm going to not let any of these bad things ever happen to you. What would have happened? What if Joseph had still been at home with Dad and his brothers? See, in just a few years, famine's going to roll through the land. Famine's going to wipe out all the food. And those people are going to go looking for food, and they come to Egypt. Well, if Joseph's not there, if Joseph's not gone through everything he's had to go through, then he's not there to tell Pharaoh, we need to store up food. There's coming a famine. It's very similar to the story of Noah. Hey, I've got to build a boat. Even though I don't see that the end is coming, I've got to build the boat. And so Joseph says, let's build the storehouse. We've got to save food because something's coming that we're not going to be prepared for. If Joseph is at home when this happens, because God said, Joseph, you're just too important. You've prayed, God, I don't want to deal with all that, so I'm not going to let you go through that. And all those people starve and die, including Joseph. But yet, because Joseph is in this difficult situation, and he says, God, I know that I'm here, and I know you can do something with it. Because it's Joseph who says, much later to his brothers, what you meant for evil, God used for good. He lived that out. That wasn't just a little saying we put on bumper stickers. That was the life of Joseph. God, you're going to use this for good, and he does. That's the attitude of life that we must have. They used Joseph's life and obedience to bring a blessing to nations. That when God told Abraham, I will use your descendants to bless the nations, he didn't wait till Jesus to start that. He started it real early. And Joseph's life is so important that despite his difficulties, Joseph was becoming the man that God would have him to be. What situations are you dealing with in life that you haven't trusted God to walk alongside you in? What situations is God saying, I just want you to use it to grow. I want you to learn through it. There's a reason I don't keep things from happening in your life. There's a reason I'm here to prove that you are enough, God. That he didn't stop Satan from tormenting Job, and he didn't stop Joseph from going into the pit and being sold into slavery, and he's not going to necessarily step in to stop every negative thing that may ever happen in your life, but he doesn't walk away when they do. God is not absent in difficulty. God is right there with us because he wants to use us to be a blessing to people. One of the most difficult things me and Tori have ever been through is the loss of a child. And I'm still asking God 2 years later, God, how do you want me to use that? Man, and it hits me. News article, New York City or New York State, abortion. Virginia, abortion. The United States, abortion. You just hear it over and over. And yet, even though the situation's different, I lost my child on an accident. They choose to. I know what it's like to lose a child. To stand before someone and say, I went through a difficult situation, and I know how God has ministered to me, and I know how God has ministered to my wife. And so I embrace when God puts me in difficult situations because I'm always looking for, God, how do you want me to minister to others? That is something that shows a testimony of faith when we can look at difficult things and say, you know what, God, how do you want to use this? See, never discount your life or the circumstances of what you've been through, but always look for how God desires to use you in that unique way to reach the world because you're the only you there is. There's no other you in the world. Even if they have the same name, they're not you. Like I told you earlier, my grandfather's name is Gary Havlin, Sr. How I'm a junior, I don't know, but I'm a junior. And we are not the same person. He is much taller than me and much meaner than me, but love him to death. But we have the same name, but we're not the same person. We don't even live in the same state. But the reality is, God is going to use us in two different ways, and that's just fine. God's going to use you in a different way than he uses your wife or your children or your friends or your family. See, this is where self-control comes in. I told you at the beginning, you can't control the circumstances, but you can control how you respond to them. That shows the heart of the person. The Christian who gives up, that's a struggle. The one who says, well, I just don't know what to do. Well, then are you trusting God with all that you are to do what he said he was going to do? That no matter what we face, no matter what is happening in our lives, no matter what has a hold on us, God is able to give us strength to overcome those things. That he doesn't just leave us where we are. The Bible does say that no temptation has overcome you except for those that you let overcome you. God's right there with us if we're willing to step in. But it's been my experience that I don't let him. Pick yourself up by the bootstraps. Do it yourself. Figure it out. You're a man. You know what to do. Hey, men, sometimes it's enough for us just to say, I don't know what to do. I'll give you a life example. You go to get in your truck one morning and you crank and it and it's just not cranking. I'm handy. I've fixed my wife's car multiple times, and so I'm thinking, what is wrong with my truck? Oh, it's the battery. So I go and I tinker with it. It's not the battery. I call a friend of mine and say, hey, what's the issue? He says, sounds like your fuel pump. I can do that on my own. And I get to taking bolts off the bed, and I'm going to pull the bed away, and it's not long into the process. I go to pick one half of the bed up, and I realize, nope, can't do this on my own. And so I have to call someone, and this is a struggle. This seems so silly, but it's a struggle for me to call someone to say, hey, can you come help me real quick? Can you come help with this? And if it's hard for me to call another human being to say, hey, I just need some more manpower to move this bed back, how hard do you think it is to say, God, I don't know how to deal with this? God, my child is driving me crazy. I don't know how to handle her. Not my child, she's an angel. But unless you go in the nursery, it's not my kid. I don't know what you're talking about. But how many parents say that to God? God, I don't know what to know. Most of the time we say, I'm going to figure it out. We'll call our mama or our daddy and we'll say, how'd you handle this when I did that? Well, this is what I did. But instead, how hard is it to say to God, God, I just don't know what to do? That I really need that. It's much harder. And so for me, this is a message to me more than it is a message to you. When Brother Dale said, you just let God decide, I said, I don't want to do that because I know that he's going to preach to me more than he is going to preach to y'all. That I have to get out of my own way and practice self-control. That if we don't, we won't be prepared when temptation does come. Because that's the second half of this message. It's only a two-pointer. Number one, it was that God desires to use us to bless others. And number two, that we have the ability to overcome temptation. Look back at that story. Day after day after day after day, Potiphar's wife came and said, please come to bed with me. And Joseph said, no. Day after day after day. I had a youth pastor, or my only youth pastor, and he told us the same thing over and over. I can remember it. I think he said it every Wednesday. Know your answer before you get to the test. Know your answers before you get to the test. In other words, know what you're going to do before you get in the situation where you've got to decide what you're going to do. Now, as a youth minister, I tell that all the time. How often do we wait until we're in the middle of a situation to decide how we're going to handle that situation? As a parent, if I had decided, I'm going to figure this thing out when she's about 16, then I think, no, I have to decide now how I'm going to handle it. All life situations, you can decide how you're going to approach it well before you get to it, even if it's not a specific example. Joseph, you're going to say no. Day after day after day after day. His problem started when he got thrown in that pit, only to be pulled out now to stand before an even more dangerous pit. And I'm not just making that up. That's Proverbs 23. For a harlot is a deep pit, and a seductress a narrow well. She was difficult to deal with. And we don't really know why. Maybe it was because she was Potiphar's wife and she owned the slaves just as much as Potiphar did. Maybe she felt like she could do what she wanted to do. Maybe she felt like she had done this before, so Joseph would just do as he was told. But she encountered a man who had decided in his heart where he stood with the Lord. She encountered a man who wasn't willing to give in to the temptation of life because he had this control of himself to stand before her and say, no, that's not what I want to do. That's not what I want to give in to. But you know, sin's just like that. I told the students on Wednesday night, we were talking about this very thing, not Potiphar and Joseph, but we were talking about how sin is like a Venus flytrap. I was watching a video of a Venus flytrap, and it's a plant that eats insects. A plant that eats insects. Now, you just think about that. I'll let you. All right, plants eat meat. Venus flytrap does. And inside the middle of that Venus flytrap, there's a sweet, syrupy sap, and it draws insects in. And it waits until they're firmly deep inside that plant, drinking of that nectar, and oh, it must taste so good. And then all of a sudden, that fly trap closes, and there's no getting out. No matter how much you beg, plead, scream, holler, however much that fly shifts and turns, it's slowly dying until it's dead. And then that sin, that fly trap just opens back up, waiting for the next person who's going to come in and say, man, that sure looks good. It sure looks like it's something I could enjoy. And all the while, it's closing in around you, and you don't even realize it. Sin was just like this woman. Day after day after day, it just says, just give in. Hey, if you just give in once, it'll be over. Right? No. But Joseph stood before her day after day, and he said no. So we have to learn from Joseph. If you give sin the smallest foothold in your life, before you know it, you're consumed. There's no going back. I was talking to a nurse, and she dealt with a lot of, she was an OBGYN nurse, and she dealt with a lot of people who were drug addicted. And so she spent a lot of time talking to mothers who were addicted to drugs like meth and heroin and things like that. And one of the things that as we were talking about that, because I don't do drugs, I don't know what drugs are like, so I can't tell you one way or the other. And I asked her, I said, how do they get on that? And she said, well, that's a good question. I've asked them. And every time I ask them, they always say, well, it started off just a little bit. It was just enough. I was dealing with difficulties, and before I knew it, I was trapped. No one was telling me I had to do it. No one was forcing me to buy it but myself. I was trapped. And I thought about how, while that's a specific example of one problem, that how easy sin is just like that. That Joseph stood and he said, no, I'm not even going to give you the opportunity to make it appear as though I've done something wrong. Why don't we have that same mindset when it comes to sin? See, Joseph had his moral reason. He said, no, you're my master's wife. You're another man's wife. I can't do that. Da-ding. That was his first reason. Told her, no, this makes no sense. Not only are you another man's wife, you're my master's wife. This is wrong. And she kept saying, no, it's not a problem. And then he hits her with the trump card, and not the president. It's a sin against God. See, at that point, she realized, I'm not going to break this guy. I'm not going to tear down the defense he has built for his life, because he realizes what sin is. Sin is not against another person. Sin is not something we do to one another. Sin is against a holy and awesome God. And when we recognize that's who we're sinning against, it changes our perspective. It changes our reality of how we approach those difficult situations. But his problem gets worse. I don't think there's any any reason to think that she didn't plan for Joseph to come home by himself. Those servants weren't there for a purpose. And she wheeled him in and she said, "Come on." And he ran. See, sometimes running is a mark of cowardice. Sometimes running from our problems doesn't make the problem go away, but sometimes running from a problem is the best thing you can do. And he ran, and he ran, and he ran. Now she wheeled and dealed, and she gets him thrown into prison because she's angry and she's mad and she has her own issues. But Joseph ran because he knew what was going to happen if he didn't control his life. He was a slave. He had very little things he could control, but the one thing he could control was himself. And so he ran. Know this, there is no shame in running from sin. There will never be shame in running from sin. Don't try to act tough and stand up to it like you can take it on, because you're not. You're not the first person it has to deal with. And you're not the first person who's tried to stand up to it only to find themselves falling apart because it worms its way in. See, as we close, self-control is an important factor in building character and preparing someone for leadership. That each and every one of us, no matter if we're in a position of authority or not, have leadership qualities in our lives, whether we lead our families, whether we lead our children, our friends, our jobs, whatever the case. And self-control is an important part of that character process. Proverbs 25:28 says that a person with no self-control is like a city with no walls. Without self-control, anything and everything can come in and out of your life just like that, and there's nothing you can do about it. And when no walls are present, nothing can stop the things in life from coming. See, contrast Joseph to this man named Samson. Samson wasn't self-controlled. Samson loved women more than he loved God. And at the end of Samson's life, even though he redeems himself, where does he find himself? At the bottom of a pile of rubble, dead. Now look at Joseph. Yeah, he's sold into slavery, but then he finds himself in Potiphar's house. And because God blesses him, because he has that self-control, he's the head of Potiphar's home until a woman destroys that in his life, and then he finds himself in prison. But you go keep reading the story. Joseph becomes the head of the prison. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think it's a good idea to make prisoners the head of the prison. But Joseph's head of the prison. And then Pharaoh has a dream. And it doesn't make sense. Find me someone who can read my dream. And so Joseph comes, and he says, I can tell you what it means. And the next thing you know, Joseph is sitting as the number 2 person in all of Egypt. Not because he was so good looking, not because he had a smooth way of talking, but because he knew how to control his life and he knew what God wanted him to do. And he knew who he served and how he was going to serve. And when brothers come looking for food, Joseph is there to save them. The brother they had sold into slavery, the brother that they had completely forgotten about, is there waiting to say, hey, I'm here. I'm here to do for you what you didn't know that you could do. Because guess what, brothers? What you meant for evil, God used for good. And God would continue to do that all the way to Jesus. And he didn't just stop there. That he continues today. So this morning, my question to you as we come to this time of response is very simple. Are you going to be that self-controlled person that God desires to use? Or are you going to keep living a reckless, dangerous life, toying with things that are well beyond your control and fall away? Let's pray.